we're spending a lot of time trying to get our data and trying to put systems in place that allows us to robustly report on our data and on our impacts, and it's not easy. Just make that point there. It's difficult to get that out, that information, with the same degree of rigour that a set of financial accounts will need, and that's where the legislation is going, and it's difficult. And certainly for ourselves, there's a degree of a lacuna till we put those systems in place before we can publish and get that information out in terms of our disclosures. We are trying, and we're looking at making publications and publishing data around our activities and our impacts, but it's a long road. It's a long road to getting that information into the domain and into the format that's going to be acceptable. Anyway, that's just an aside. As I said, a lapsed combustion chemist working with Aboud Móna. I imagine most people in the audience are familiar with Aboud Móna, a semi-state company that has been peat harvesting is a term that the company has previously used. Some people call it extraction, some people call it strip mining. That's that. The end of the last decade, the decision was made to cease our involvement in extracting peat. And since then, again, alluded to the Minister very kindly, we've embarked on our brown to green strategy. And I suppose that has three legs. One in the circular economy, which is our recycling and waste collection business. Secondly, we have the land use side of the business, which is looking at the remediation, and a lot of work done on the remediation of the peatlands. I think, if I'm not mistaken, about maybe 14,000 hectares of former cutaway peatland has been rehabilitated since we started the EDRIS, or the PCAS, the Peatlands Climate Action Scheme, 3 years ago. And then the final leg of the business is the renewable energy business, and again, moving away from fossil as a source of electricity or source of power to renewables. And at the moment, we have 700 megawatts, thereabouts 700 megawatts under management or partly owned and JVs, with an ambition to get that to about 2,000 megawatts, both onshore and offshore, within the next 10 years. I just want to leave, I was told I wasn't allowed any slides, but I pleaded with Aideen, and I've been allowed dispensation for 2 slides. And I think these are very telling. Is this one's come up? Yeah. This is the Bellicoric peat station, probably about 1993 in North Mayo. And for those of you with really good eyesight, you can see on the right-hand side there, Ireland's first industrial wind farm, and that was the Bellicoric, or the RILE, the Renewable Energy Ireland. It was actually, the company was incorporated as Renewable Energy Ireland Limited. That's how long ago the company, that wind farm, I think there was 22 turbines there producing 6.4 megawatts. And you can see again, it's a black and white photograph, but you can see on the right-hand side the peatlands that were at what was called the home bog for that power station that was feeding the power in there. That was, as I said, probably about 93. This photograph, although not taken from the exact same location, okay, shows the situation now in Onini with the wind farm, the new Onini wind farm, which is a 94 megawatt wind farm. And again, for those of you with very good eyesight, on the right hand side you can just see the small turbines that were the original Bellicoric farm. Obviously the power station has been dismantled, and you are beginning to see some examples of rehabilitation of the peatlands that were the former home bog for that power station there. And that, I think, those 2 slides, if you were asking me to describe what Aboud Móna is doing. I should also add, sorry, just that there's obviously a biodiversity win as well once you start the rehabilitation process for the cutaway peatlands. But those 2 slides, I think, or those 2 images, sum up the direction that of the historical direction of Aboud Móna, the historical activities and the future direction of the organisation. So happy to get the conversation going. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, John. And also, I love the slides. I don't know what you're talking about. No, he was allowed slides if they were just pictures, and they were excellent pictures. So next up, we have Marc Aboud. Marc Aboud is with us from Deloitte Ireland, who appeared to be involved in the day in some way. I don't know. So Marc is, let me get your title right, Marc, because I think, did you recently get promoted? Is this a promotion?
Risk and regulatory.
There you go. Marc is Sustainability Risk and Regulatory Lead at Deloitte Ireland. So he's a chartered accountant. He's got a huge amount of global experience in both financial accounting, sustainability accounting and reporting as well. He's formerly worked in the New York office of Deloitte, and he's going to speak to us about the rapidly evolving regulatory landscape around climate and biodiversity and what that means for business. So let's give a welcome to Marc.
So thank you, Aideen, fellow panel members and audience members as well, and the centre. Absolutely delighted to be here. I think it's been an absolutely great day. So thank you. So as Aideen said, I'm a director in Deloitte, and I specifically focus on our sustainability risk and regulatory practice. So we help organisations, some of the large corporates that we've talked about today, mitigate their sustainability risks, identify opportunities, but also comply with sustainability regulation as well. And it's moving at quite fast pace at the moment. And there's a number of drivers out in the market when it comes to sustainability issues and some of the clients that we work with. And these include rising stakeholder awareness, such as their customers and their suppliers that they work with, increasing investor sentiment, and also the changing risk landscape as well, which has evolved rapidly over the last number of years. But the driver really accelerating things over the last number of years is the reporting and regulatory landscape for some of these corporates. And there have been over 400 regulatory and reporting and policy changes since 2015 in this space. The scope varies jurisdiction to jurisdiction, which makes it quite tricky, particularly for large organisations. And these requirements vary as well between some being voluntary and some being mandatory. And it's probably fair to say, just in the context of the theme of today being biodiversity, that the primary regulatory focus over the last number of years has been on climate and societal issues rather than wider environmental matters such as biodiversity. So I think clearly this needs to be addressed. So according to the World Economic Forum, 50% of the global economy is under threat from biodiversity loss. However, corporates currently do not have all the information needed to understand how nature impacts their organisation, but also how their organisation impacts nature. And the challenge is it's difficult to measure, and we've talked quite a bit about this today as well. If you think about climate, a tonne of carbon in Ireland is the same as a tonne of carbon in China. But how to report and measure nature or biodiversity loss is extremely difficult, and I know it's something that Fabiola is going to touch on later. But there's a growing recognition that nature-based related risks can affect long-term enterprise value, and that managing those risks is essential to building resilient businesses and societies. Nature and biodiversity loss is linked to climate change, as we have discussed today, and without addressing both, we can't resolve either. So a common challenge for organisations is they know they need to do something, but they just don't know where to start. So I wanted to talk to you about an initiative, an industry-led initiative called the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TNFD. And the mission of the TNFD is to develop and deliver a risk management and disclosure framework for organisations to report and act on the evolving nature-related risks. We've all heard about net zero as a target for organisations, but the TNFD aims to support a shift in global financial flows away from nature-negative outcomes and towards nature-positive outcomes. There's three components to the TNFD framework. The first is a language system. So the TNFD framework defines the concepts and vocabulary organisations need to understand nature as a business issue. And this includes defining risk types like physical risk, but transitionary risk as well, and how that affects organisations such as policy change when it comes to biodiversity or nature-related risk. But also systemic risks, so categorised by certain tipping points, extinction of species and raw materials, and the impact that has and the dependencies that it has on certain organisations. But there are also opportunities. It's not all about the risk. So entering new markets, new products and services, and also how it impacts an organisation's reputation. Secondly, the TNFD outlines disclosure recommendations. So these recommendations are aligned with global reporting standards and build on the pillars of those disclosure elements. So governance, including the role of the board and the senior executive team, tone at the top is critical when addressing these types of matters. Strategy, including for financial planning over the short, medium and long term. Risk management, including how nature risks are integrated into the wider risk management framework of an organisation. And then metrics and targets, including performance and how that's measured. And then finally, the TNFD includes guidance on how to approach nature-related risk management. And it's structured around an acronym called LEAP. So this means locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare, which is further broken down into sub-steps that organisations can follow. And the reason why it's structured this way is many nature-related risks are highly local. So understanding the specifics of location is central to the TNFD and its LEAP process. So what's important for fresh water supplies or soil health or flood defences in one part of the world or one country can be very different to another. So this has major implications for the granularity of the data needed. The task force is an industry-led task force led by the UN, but it has 40 members representing organisations with $20 trillion worth of assets under management. It's been developing the framework over the last year and a half, and it's looking to publish it for market adoption later this year in September 2023. So we highly recommend that organisations or any representative organisations in the room start to get prepared for this framework, engage with it, become a member of the TNFD forum, keep up to date with the latest changes and standards. It's continuing to evolve. Test the TNFD, run a pilot, see how it works in certain parts of your organisation and roll it out firm-wide, and then learn from that as well. Provide feedback via the online platform to the TNFD governing body. So I hope that this is one element or one catalyst of many that we're discussing today, and for organisations to accelerate to be more nature positive. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Marc. Fantastic. Okay, so our next speaker, I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, Dr. Fabiola Schneider. Fabiola is an assistant professor in finance at DCU Business School. Her current research is focused on climate emergency and sustainable transitions. She's an expert in sustainable finance. She also is currently working with the European Commission's platform on sustainable finance. She's co-leading projects on digitisation in the field of environmental data, and she can definitely explain it a lot better than I do. So welcome, Fabiola.
Yes, so welcome from myself as well. On the last slot today, I'm delighted that there's still such a big and diverse crowd. Well done for still being here. Thanks for this lovely introduction, and thank you, Marc, for setting the scene perfectly for my talk now. So I'm an assistant professor in finance, in sustainable finance, which still raises some eyebrows every now and then. Isn't that an oxymoron? No, I actually dedicated my career to the idea that finance could be a key lever in really accelerating and driving the transformation of our economy. As Marc mentioned, the biggest driver at the moment is probably regulation. Mandatory reporting requirements are coming to the market. It's a huge toolbox, and Europe is really at the forefront of this. There's multiple levels that this is addressing. We have the entity level, so corporations that have to report at an entity level. We have it in the financial space where investors have to report on financial products. But what I would like to talk about is the EU taxonomy, the EU green taxonomy, and that's about sustainable activities. So defining what makes an economic activity green. Now the really big important part about green in this context, where the European Union really is at the forefront, is that it's 6 environmental objectives. So it's not just climate. 2 of those objectives are climate related. It's climate change mitigation, but also adaptation. So not just climate change needs to stop, but also how do we learn to live with it. And then there's 4 more, and they're all equally weighted. That's quite to say something. And of those 4 criterion, of course, one of them, biodiversity and ecosystems. So this regulation is really saying we're putting biodiversity at the same level as climate change. The other ones are about pollution prevention, water systems, and also circular economy. So it's a really ambitious proposal, to say the least. If anyone's curious on the actual criteria here, how do we define substantial contribution to, for example, biodiversity? The consultation is out at the moment, so those draft criteria have been published. Do have a look at the European Commission's website. have your say. We talked about it a lot today, that it's important to get everyone involved, get your voice heard if you have an opinion. The consultation is open until next week. As Aideen mentioned, I'm actually involved in the development process, if you wish. I'm part of the platform on sustainable finance. That's a technical advisory group. Important word here, advisory, unfortunately doesn't mean decision-making, it means making recommendations. So just like anyone doing a response to this consultation, that's what we do. We give advice and comment on what the European Commission themselves do. It's a technical advisory group which has academics, but also all sorts of stakeholders, so NGOs, industry bodies, and so on. And one of the big things that we're doing is we're working on the data science hub, because data, of course, is the underlying driver of all the decision making. If you want science-based decisions, you probably need some sort of data, may that be qualitative or quantitative. And as Marc outlined, there's still some challenges in certain areas. So what the Data Science Hub, as part of this platform, does, or what I do, is an academic project on biodiversity and self-enhancing benchmarks. Self-enhancing benchmarks could be a key driver of redirecting capital flows, and there is a working example of this, and that's why this is such an important topic. We have Paris-aligning benchmarks. Paris-aligning benchmarks, already in the market, 116 billion that are in this market at the moment. That's huge amounts of money that are dedicated specifically to tackle one of these 6 environmental objectives, climate change mitigation. As the name suggests, Paris-aligning, this is to realize that carbon emission reduction, greenhouse gas emission reduction, that we need to get to net zero. How does that work in practice? What does self-enhancing benchmark mean, really? Well, you pick the starting point, which we know. We have our current carbon budgets, and we know how much carbon we're roughly producing at the moment, and we know where we need to get net zero, right? So you can draw a line, you can take a geometric average, and you know how to get there. That was done based on the data that the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel, which means that there's no bias in terms of countries. It's really this global project that hopefully is fairly free of individual agendas. And the UN emission gap report came up with, and they drew that line and they realized, well, it should be 7% year-on-year absolute emission reductions that we need to get to net zero. And that's what this Paris-aligning benchmark means. If you want to invest according to this benchmark, your portfolio has to decrease in emissions. There's a phase-in approach for all scopes, but in theory, all scopes, year-on-year 7%. If you don't, you drop out of the average. So, wonderful tool that can really shift trillions into this impact approach. Now, we would love to have the same for all environmental criterion. So, not just climate change mitigation, but all the others as well. And that's what we're doing at the moment. So, we're trying to come up with a wonderful KPI that we can put into this index, the self-enhancing benchmark. Now, for carbon emissions, the beauty is we have already the KPI, the key performance indicator, and that is carbon dioxide equivalence. That little E that you often see in reports, that's really the beauty of carbon emission accounting that we have, because we managed to get one number that has the global overview of emissions. So no matter where it's emitted, no matter what kind of greenhouse gas, you can all express it in carbon emission equivalence. And we need to get to this one KPI for all the different environmental objectives. Then we can put it in a benchmark and we can set a target to achieve it. How did this happen in carbon emission equivalence? You have global warming potentials, so you just index everything to carbon dioxide, which is the one, and then you compare everything else. For example, methane, one of the other big greenhouse gases, has a potential roughly of 25, so you're just saying over a specified amount of time, 100 years, methane is roughly 25 times as bad as carbon dioxide. And we would love to develop the same idea on biodiversity. Now, with biodiversity, the problem is that it's much more geospatial. Your data is not as global, and you have very much local effects that need to be factored in. So that's the challenge we're facing at the moment, to come up with this one key performance indicator. So my call to this very knowledgeable and diverse crowd here is, anyone having bright ideas, do get in touch. We're currently developing this. As a sneak peek, we have made quite some progress on the conceptual side for a social KPI, which is very dangerous territory usually if we're talking European Commission, because the social taxonomy is a project that was initially envisioned but has stalled quite a lot because of the political dimension to it. Well, we can all agree that we want to save the planet. It's much harder to agree what exactly democracy means, what exactly freedom means. To put that into targets is a bit more difficult, so usually the social taxonomy is something that the green taxonomy smartly just ignores for our purposes, but we developed a self-enhancing benchmark for gender parity, because gender parity is less difficult to define. Parity just means balance, so that means 50-50. So you can look at corporate leadership at the moment. You can see where a company stands at that, and you can say, well, we want to reach parity. We're going to give you X amount of years. You can draw that line, and then you can say, well, you have to increase by, say, 5 basis points every 3 years in order to meet that gender parity. So thanks for that. I'm looking forward to our discussion and bright ideas, because we need a collaborative effort to get to it.
Thank you, Fabiola. You've made my day talking about the numbers and the accounting. I love it more. Okay, so it is time for our final speaker of the panel and pretty much of the day. So I want to introduce, it's best till last, Paul, best till last. I want to introduce Paul Harris, who is Sustainable Product Innovation Lead at Bank of Ireland. And like all of our other speakers, Paul has extensive experience. He was talking about nature and climate in businesses before it was trendy, and he was talking about it to his fellow bankers. So we could definitely learn a thing or two from Paul. At Bank of Ireland, he has led the bank's participation in environmental markets since 2004. He has also been chair of Sustainable Nation Ireland. He served on CDP Ireland, Irish Forum on Natural Capital. He's also designed something he'll hopefully mention a little bit, the first securitisation of ecosystem services, which is the Woodland Nature Credit. And he recently launched a sustainable agriculture product, in partnership with Kerry Group. So we're looking forward to hearing some great insights from Paul. He has to toe the line on his speech here, so you're going to keep this speech really short, but in the Q&A you can say whatever you like, right? So get some good questions ready for Paul.
Thank you very much. Marc, thanks very much for the invitation. I owe you. Following on from John, my confession is that I'm not a scientist or an ecologist or an environmentalist. I'm not particularly interested in nature as a hobby either. I don't watch David Attenborough. Although as a 10-year-old, I did help put together a school nature reserve. But that had less to do with a commitment to nature and more to do with the fact that it meant that I got out of lessons. So there you go. And here I am this afternoon getting out of work, so it doesn't change. I suppose it's important that I'm not a big nature buff, but I am very curious, and I have been curious for about 20 years now about environmental risk and environmental markets. And that curiosity has endured, and I suppose I'm obsessed with the intellectual challenge of marshalling the new nature markets to deliver impact. And unusually for a banker, I think impact first, income second, a close second, obviously. What I want to do today is look at, give an overview, give my opinion on what I think the corporate response to climate change and biodiversity loss is. I want to explain why I think it's inadequate, make a suggestion of how we can change it, and then, as promised, I'll deliver a little piece about an interesting product which shows how a new approach can deliver decent, beneficial outcomes. So, in terms of climate change, where we are today, the majority of companies, I think, understand that climate change is a risk to their bottom line. They understand about the transition. They understand that they need to change their business models to a low carbon one. So that might involve renewable energy procurement, building retrofits, EVs, so on. There's an acceptance that the climate action legislation, coupled with the EU Fit for 55 programme, is going to be transformational for business. And Marc will probably be able to tell you in better detail, but we're aware that most large companies are grappling at the moment with the introduction of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which kicks in January. which is going to ramp up the obligations on companies for their environmental disclosures, and I think that's going to be a bit of a game changer. So climate action, probably B+. Only gave it a Marc because I'm at DCU. Frustrated lecturer, but anyway. So brings us on to biodiversity loss. That's a bit of a different story. The adoption of corporate action in that space has been patchy at best. And we're told that it's more difficult for corporates to understand, that it's very, very complicated. I don't buy that at all. I think it's very simple. Businesses love simplicity as well. It involves a single number, and that number's 50. Okay? In the last 50 years, we've lost 50% of our ecosystem. That's kind of simple. Businesses rely on goods and services provided by those ecosystems, and they're essential and irreplaceable. And over half, 50% of global GDP is reliant on these ecosystem services. So ecosystem services have significant economic value and present a material financial risk if they're degraded. That's the message that will resonate with corporates. You notice I avoided the use of the terms nature and biodiversity, far too abstract in business. I know that the minister previously was challenged about nature, the narrative and terminology. I think that's hugely important. My own view is that the narrative for the two agendas, the climate change and biodiversity loss, has been dominated by the scientific and ecological churches, as it will. And what we need to do is translate the issues into business-friendly terminology if we're to achieve the engagement and action to the extent that the crises demand. Firstly, I think it would be helpful to acknowledge that climate change and biodiversity loss are two sides of the same coin. Both are far-reaching in terms of magnitude. Both contain tipping points from which it's going to be impossible to recover. They're uncertain, yet foreseeable. And the impact of actions that we carry out today will have impact in the future. So climate change and biodiversity loss constitute environmental risk to business. And when you start talking about environmental risk to businesses, they understand, because they look at credit risk, they look at market risk, financial risk, and they can devise strategies, and they're happy to do so once they understand it. So if we adopt the language of business and talk about natural capital, reflecting ecosystem services provision, and risks to the deterioration of those natural assets, I believe that traction and action from businesses and financial institutions will be accelerated. I want to turn now to the real example of how this can play out, where corporate actions can sit between the relationship between climate change and biodiversity loss and generate beneficial outcomes. So in December 2019, the bank was approached by Quilcher Nature, the not-for-profit arm of Quilcher, who were looking for funding for the establishment of new native woodlands. They've got a program to deliver hundreds of thousands of hectares, so they were just looking for a mechanism, a way to do it. The woodlands are non-commercial, and they'd exist in perpetuity, and there'd be open access. And initially, the guys were looking for about €2 million. So the challenge was to design a product with no obvious cash flow from which to repay the loan. The solution that I came up with was focused on ecosystem services that would be generated by these new woodlands, namely carbon sequestration, biodiversity uplift and amenity value. The ecosystem services would be securitized in credit form and sold to corporates who wanted to offset environmental exposure in pursuance of their own ESG strategies. The value of the future flow of ecosystem services from the woodlands can be calculated using existing fairly globally accepted methodologies and standards. So importantly as well, very importantly, the ownership of the land and the trees remain the property of Culture. So that avoids any accusations of selling or commoditization of nature. Just as an aside, interestingly, when I presented this mechanism, the Woodland Nature Credit, to the guys in the bank and some corporates, they understood carbon sequestration, they understood biodiversity, didn't get social amenity at all. Then COVID lockdown happened. And I suppose after a couple of months of a 5-kilometre travel restriction, everybody got the value of amenity. My favourite, I think everybody has a favourite stat from COVID. Mine, blank faces, it's just me. Mine is that the week after the lockdown was lifted in Ireland, the footfall across the Culture estate increased by 720% and remained above 500% for the remainder of the year, which is staggering. So if anybody tries to persuade you that people aren't interested in nature and don't support it, quote that one. It's a goodie. Anyway, so the success of the transaction, because we couched the proposition in terms of natural capital and ecosystem services, we got the corporate engagement, which was overwhelmingly positive and got the deal over the line. AXA Insurance actually lifted the entire issue in one. You've probably seen the advertisements. They used the benefits to offset the motoring impact of their Irish policyholders. So, interestingly, this product addressed biodiversity repair and climate change mitigation by applying a financial value to ecosystem services in a way that spoke to corporates in terms of risk, value, and benefits. We've since done a 5 million tranche subsequently for Aviva, which means that in total we've generated 600 hectares of new native woodlands in Ireland. That's over 1.8 million trees. And this model, securitizing ecosystem services, was used in this example for forestry, but could quite easily be adjusted to things like peatland restoration and marine conservation. So, have I been talking too long? Sorry. I'll close out now. So I'll just close by saying that I think importantly, the pathway for unlocking capital flow at scale into nature has been well established. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul, and all of our panellists. So it is time for Q&A. If you have a question for the panellists, and I can see hands coming up already, I will send I'll send the roving mic, or I'll just let you know. Yeah, brilliant. There are 2 roving mics. Perfect. So we'll take questions in groups 2 or 3. We might start with, actually, there are 2 people over here, right behind each other, so we'll go with those 2 first.
Hi, thank you very much for 4 very interesting presentations. 2 quick questions. First of all, first one to John. How is Bord na Móna's Just Transition programme going? Can you say anything about that? And my second question is to Fabiola. You've spoken a lot about availability of fairly massive amounts of funding for mitigation. But I mean, how can we get private sector involvement in funding of adaptation and of funding of loss and damage, particularly in the global south? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Sive O'Neill, Stop Climate Chaos. Thanks very much for all those presentations. I just have to bring up the question of offsetting with Paul particularly. So I love the work that you've done there to actually develop those new native woodlands, and hats off to Coillte for investing in that and for Bank of Ireland, getting together. However, nobody here, and put your hands up if you disagree, believes that the emissions that come out of your car can be offset by planting trees. And there's a basic scientific fact behind that. There are people here who will explain it better than me, but essentially carbon dioxide remains in the atmosphere forever, and the sequestration in forestry is much more uncertain and unlikely to be permanent. That's not to say that planting trees is a bad idea. We should do it, but we can't be developing corporate sustainability strategies on the basis of offsetting. Now, I know there's a lot more to be said about this, but I just have to challenge that because it came up in a number of ways. And I would hate to think that as we move into the kind of nature-based equivalent of the climate reporting and disclosure mechanisms, that we fall into the same traps.
Yeah, we might take one more in this round.
Yeah, I was fascinated looking at the corporate world and its response to climate change. But basically, and it's connected to the previous speaker, what Sive said, the bottom line for businesses is money and finance and how they can continue to make money. And I would be very worried, and I agree with Paul about the language we use in engaging with businesses is crucial. We need to use language in a way that they can connect with in terms of the environment. But my big concern is like Sive's, greenwashing. I see too many companies claiming we've planted so many trees or we've done this, that or the other. So how do you, my question to the panel, how do you ensure this has an authentic impact on the environment and biodiversity as against enhancing the branding of that company that, oh, we are a green company? I really have serious questions about some companies that market that idea. And I would like to know what level of policing is there, the same as we have Made in Ireland for food producers. What policing service is there to check how green are your credentials as a company as against greenwashing? Thanks.
Okay, brilliant. I think we've got three good questions there. So we had just transition funding, we had greenwashing, we also had offsets. So I might go, John, would you like to talk about just transition first? And actually any of the other questions as well.
Okay, thanks very much, and thanks for the question. Specifically on Bord na Móna's Just Transition programme, I suppose one of the first things is, and there's a degree of circularity in this, a lot of our colleagues that would have previously been involved in the peat harvesting are actually the operatives that are out on the ground delivering the initiatives around the rehabilitation. I think there's probably over 200 operatives there. Supporting them are an enhanced backroom team or professionals across a number of disciplines. That's including civil engineers, ecologists, hydrologists, GIS mappers, all ensuring that the interventions that are taking place as part of the rehabilitation are best in practice. And I suppose, getting back to why this is a just transition piece, it's the fact that we've managed to sort of redeploy and keep activities in areas of the Midlands that statistically would have been not as I suppose wealthy in the traditional metrics as other parts of the country. So I suppose we've kept jobs in the Midlands, effectively, doing activities that didn't exist heretofore. getting back to the skill sets that's developed, and I was smiling when earlier on today when there was calls to the Minister around funding of MPWS. The ability of that team, both the operatives and the professional team behind them, actually have managed to essentially sell their services to other third parties, including the MPWS, around the rehabilitation of lands that are outside the Bord na Móna estate. Again, activities that wouldn't have existed 5 or 10 years ago, but for our exit from peat. And then on a more specific one, I see some other colleagues here today, Alan, we've set up our Green Accelerator in the Midlands, where we're looking at bringing in companies, a pretty broad church of companies that are involved in new sustainable businesses at a level that can be easily ramped up, and we're seeing a lot of engagement there. Some great successes there in that area as well. But again, that's out of one of our sites that was previously home to machineries for peat harvesting at the Bora facility. So again, trying to work within our traditional heartlands and not just exit the stage in that area.
Super, thanks, John. There was a question there about offsetting, and I think several of the panel will be qualified to speak to this. Paul, do you want to start, and then maybe Fabiola will get your take as well.
Yeah, does it? Right, here we go. Yeah, first of all, you mentioned that something around the fact that afforestation was the outcomes are uncertain. There was impermanent. Yeah, potentially. Yeah, so that means potentially that they are permanent. And I suppose just in terms of the Wood and Nature Credit, I can assure you that what we did is we've put in place legal safeguards to make sure that those forests and the woodlands on both tranches are spread throughout Ireland. They're not in just one lump, because investors love diversification as well. So so the risk-wise, there's a 20% buffer in terms of the calculation as well. So I'd be very confident that the outcome is robust, and they'll exist for 100 years. I won't be around in 100 years, but my grandchildren come back and attest to it. I think also as well, there's a lot of people who are anti-offsetting. And as soon as I see offsetting, it's a no. And I draw a distinction between offsetting and credits. And this particular product was a Wood and Nature Credit. It wasn't actually offsetting anything. It was new, so it was additional. So that credit is worth something. The issue that I had was that the company that bought them to offset their motorists, that's marketing, really. It's not moving the dial. So in some ways I was a bit peeved about that, because as I said before, I'm about impact. But I don't think that I also think that it's important that corporates get given the tools to make the transition. They can't flick a switch and go from being a brown company to a green company overnight. And I think John articulated that well. They're on a journey. So in order to keep on that journey, to have access to offsets that they can use whilst they are on a certain trajectory, I think is a really useful tool, and it's something that's should actually be encouraged rather than frowned upon. Do you want to talk about greenwashing?
No, that's perfect.
As well?
Actually, if you give us your take on greenwashing, and then we'll let Fabiola and Marc come in.
Yeah, you see, it brings me on to greenwashing. When is greenwashing not greenwashing? And to your point, it 90% of the time it actually is. And I think there's a duty on people like myself that are delivering products into the market to make sure they're used properly and not abused. There's EU legislation on greenwashing and labelling, which has been introduced, but by the same token, I think people need to understand that all companies are on a journey. You see companies that have put beehives on the top of their building and think they're absolutely brilliant and fantastic, but in terms of biodiversity value, it's not great. But they think they were doing the right thing. It wasn't out of badness, God love them. So that needs to be factored in as well. I think we need to be kind as well as critical to companies that are trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, Fabiola, you were right.
So I would probably also add to the discussion on offsetting. Well, we can agree that on language, yes, offsetting is a very broad term and we need to be very precise when we criticize it, though I would very much agree with the lady who brought up this question that a lot of the voluntary offsetting markets are just not delivering the results that we need them to deliver, and that there's fundamental problems with the idea of a voluntary carbon offsetting market. However, regulated carbon credit markets like the EU ETS, that's a different discussion that should be had. On the voluntary side, however, I would just like to draw your attention to the example of South Pole. That's the biggest climate advisory company that was out there, so-called carbon unicorn. It's a private company that has a valuation over 1 billion. So this massive company, biggest trader and marketer of voluntary carbon offsets in, of course, countries that are not here in the Western area, selling carbon credits to companies that we all know, Gucci and so on, but with projects based in the Global South where allegedly they were doing social good as well. This company now is under fire because they massively overstated the impact that they've had. Even employees are quitting over it because senior management is trying to sweep it under the rug rather than really engaging with the problems. These schemes are officially certified, so a lot of schemes that are under fire now, they're red schemes, a lot of regulation in place, however, they're still not delivering the result. The problem is that offset really doesn't tell you what it's doing. We talked about planting trees, but actually you can get offsets for something even more ridiculous than saying you're planting a tree, for avoiding emissions. That means you're not cutting down a tree. So you're getting a carbon credit just for not doing something, which there is, of course, reasons to do protection of forests. That's a very noble reason, and we need to protect environment. But a lot of the time, the danger that that tree was in is massively overstated, because it's a very difficult task to measure how much at risk is really something of being deforested. Because these projects are often for, like, these trees are being cut down for firewood, it's poverty areas. But how do you quantify how much of those trees will be cut down? It's only in hindsight that we can now do sometimes an assessment, so we see neighboring areas and we look at the forest that wasn't protected and how much has been cut down. And that has been done via satellite images, and the result is that between 4 and 16 times, that's the overestimation. So around 4 to 16 times too many offsets have been sold over what would actually have happened. So the impact has been massively overstated with a lot of corporations claiming offsets where they probably shouldn't have. So voluntary offsetting markets, very critical. Regulated markets, there's probably much more of less of a risk of greenwashing.
Is this working? Yeah. Just to address this gentleman's comment on greenwashing, and I think it's a really fair point, and clearly there's more to be done in relation to this. And maybe to give a regulatory perspective as well, because currently there's no regulation that mandates that there should be assurance over sustainability reports. That's going to change. So when the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive comes into force later this year, so I think, Paul, you referred to it earlier, over 60,000 firms across the EU, many of which are in Ireland, large firms, will need to report on sustainability matters. So they'll need to report on their transition plan. They'll need to conduct a double materiality assessment. So what that means is they'll need to assess risks and how they impact society and the environment, but also how the environment and societal issues impact them. They'll also need to report in a HTML data format. So in the same way that you report your financial statements, they'll need to report sustainability matters as well. So a huge system uplift for many organisations as well. I know, John, we were talking about that before the panel. It's from a complexity perspective. But I think the other thing that the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive is bringing in, or the CSRD, just to bring another acronym into the mix. There's enough acronyms when it comes to climate and biodiversity, but it will require mandatory assurance over sustainability reporting and over ESRS standards as well, which are sustainability standards. I think one thing you mentioned in terms of the bottom line and the focus on profits, I think is a fair comment as well. But I think as well, like a couple of years ago, I was the chief of staff to our CEO, and as a professional services firm, we'd have hundreds of graduates come to us at the beginning of the year that are looking to work for Deloitte and really interested in the firm, etc., and wanting to be chartered accountants. And often the CEO would come and talk to these graduates and talk to them about how what it's like to work in a firm like Deloitte. And over the last couple of years, these students not only ask about what Deloitte is doing about climate change, but they ask what the CEO is doing about it and what it means to he or she. So it's become very personal for a certain generation as well. And I think for large corporates, they can't ignore this. If they want to attract top talent, they need to focus on climate and societal issues. And I think as well, it's a risk. And those organisations that don't consider this as a risk today won't be here in the next 5-10 years. And that's another way of thinking about it as well.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Just one point in relation to the CSRD, and I think it's around profit. And I suppose I've worked in the regulatory side for a long time, and invariably when you'd be responding to a policy paper, your opening paragraph would normally contain a phrase about the need for joint up thinking, okay, irrespective of what the consultation was. But I have to say, and I have a certain admiration for the Commission in how the CSRD was spawned. It was spawned out of the Green Deal, and their officials recognised follow the money. Okay, and that's where they've gone into the CSRD, as well as having and the taxonomy directive as well. It's sort of the the taxonomy regulation and the CSRD directive. They'll be working hand in glove, but they'll follow the money back up. The corporates will report first, and then the financiers and the capital markets, and then the investors will see where their money is going in this assured scheme. It will take time, okay, for this to wash through. Previously I mentioned, is it Luca Pacioli was the Italian monk that invented double entry accounting. It's taken 700 years to get a system for one metric, i.e. pound, shillings and pence. We're now looking at 84 metrics in the CSRD and expect to have that in with standards and guidance within the next 2 years. But my point is, the ambition that the Commission have shown and the rounded way that this has been developed, I think deserves for me to sort of give the policymakers a pat on the back on this one in terms of how they've designed the scheme.
Thank you all very much for those responses. So I was given the 5-minute warning like 3 minutes ago. So I think we've time for a couple more questions. I'm just going to take 2 questions, I'm afraid, from the audience. And actually, if we can take these 2 ladies in the front, and I'll use it as the opportunity for our panel to give a last word. Everyone can give a last word.
Is the prospect of offsetting is all very well, but really what we really need to do is divest money, try to divest funds going into banking. If we're still investing in fossil fuel companies, what's the point? We're only tinkering at the edges with offsetting and all that. We really can't be investing any financial institutions anymore in fossil fuel. We need some commitments to divest, I think, from that.
Hi, Deirdre Mortel from Rethink Ireland. So changing the topic a little bit, very conscious that the panel is called Corporate Responses to Climate Change and Biodiversity Loss, and we've sort of had a climate finance panel, so I'm shifting it to ESG and the S part and how the S links with the E. Okay, so one of the things that we do is we raise philanthropy from large corporates and then apply it to tackling Ireland's critical social and environmental issues. So I'm thinking about the green transition, the just transition, the circular economy, those kinds of issues in this case. And, 2% of global philanthropy is applied to climate change. 2%. And we don't have the data for Ireland, but I think that would be about right. It might even be 1% in Ireland. So there's almost no philanthropy of corporates being applied. And yet, philanthropy is growing in Ireland at the moment. So we also raise philanthropy around things like educational disadvantage, mental health, equality, all kinds of different things. So I guess I'm noting the difference. And my question is, does the panel have any views on why the large corporates are embracing the climate challenge in all the ways we've talked about, but not embracing it in their CSR or philanthropy programs at all?
Okay, those are two fantastic questions to close on. So I'm going to ask each of the panel, and I'm going to start with you, Paul, in a minute and go up this way, to give, you can respond to the questions if you can, and also give your final word very, very briefly, because we're going way over time, and I don't know what comes after the 5-minute sign. It's probably like the shut up, Aideen sign. I'll get you to respond. So we have our questions on divestment. We had a question earlier on funding that we didn't really get to, and also the question on the philanthropy.
Yeah, on the divestment, I worked with the guys in Maynooth on the fossil fuel divestment program, and one of the big problems that I had around divestment was all very well the religious orders selling their shares and bonds in fossil fuels and thinking that's great, but somebody bought those, so the capital still supported fossil fuels. And you're right, this is actually about how do we prompt a reallocation of capital, because climate change to me is as big as the Industrial Revolution was in 1815. It's groundbreaking, and we need to encourage the reallocation of capital. And that needs to be done by the public. It needs to be done by pension holders. It needs to be done by the government as well. And it needs to be done by corporates and institutions. Absolutely. But I'm not sure that penny has really dropped. Interestingly, if you look at how BP and Shell raise money at the moment, they're raising money to pay in the capital markets to pay dividends to themselves, which is a clear indication that the model is broken. So I absolutely agree with your point about divestment, but that it's a collective effort, and until the governments of the world stop subsidising, you're never going to get divestment. So I think that's a good start. Yeah, it's an interesting question that you raise about the S in ESG, and it's one that we have in Bank of Ireland. We've slated that as a focus for this year. So it's around how do we develop it, but we're treating it separately as opposed to part of climate change, because climate change belongs really to the E as opposed to the S. But I've been doing research for the last 2 months on the allocation of capital, and in terms of the social needs, and it's absolutely incredible how lacking it is, and in actual fact, how so many charities are able to deliver what they can do. It's that is financial alchemy. So I'd like some of that. But yes, that's going to be a focus, and I actually think that it's a growing focus as well. So people will treat the S in ESG on a par with environmental and climate change strategies. Don't know if that answers your question.
Perfect.
Yeah, thanks very much. I actually love the question on divestment because that's something I've been trying to get people to understand, and I get to exactly that point that Paul brought up about someone else buying it, which is usually the problem. But let's go one step back, and what's the decision here? So we have those fossil fuel companies that need capital, and they raise it in two different ways. They have equity capital, so shareholders, and they have debt capital. And when people talk about divestment, they usually only talk about equities. You even mentioned bonds, but the problem with equities is someone else buys them. It's a share in a company, so it never expires, it doesn't come mature. The company cash flow is not affected by this. So this transaction really is happening on secondary markets between investors. The company, of course, if this happens at large scale, has to care if the share price goes down, but even then, you're not going bankrupt if your share price goes down. The much more important side here is the debt side, so bond markets and loan markets. Because these financial instruments, they actually put you at risk of default. If you don't pay back on your debt, you're bankrupt. Also, they have maturities, which means that you have to refinance them. In the current world, no one actually pays back their debt. It's a strategic decision on how much debt you take on, but at some point you have to repay it. What you do is you raise fresh capital and you pay off your old bond. So one bond comes mature, you raise the next one. And that's really the key moment to influence. Because if investors deny this fresh capital, you cannot pay back your old debt. And that's putting you at serious risk. Of course, you will find a different way, but it's probably going to be more expensive. So any investor trying to have an impact should really engage on the bond and loan side. On the bonds, we have pretty good transparency as well. There is data. We can see when a bond comes mature. So any investor trying to have an impact can see when does the next bond come mature in 100 days. Well, I can start today to impact. I can start engagement on this side today and tell the company what I want in terms of conditions to refinance this bond, because it's entirely possible to put conditions on financing. This is not a new concept. We have covenants for years and years. Usually they refer to financial KPIs. So if you give out money, you're tying it to a condition of you cannot take on more debt or whatever. You can also do this with sustainability targets. It's called sustainability-linked bonds. So you make a company promise, well, if I give you this bond, if I finance the activities, you promise me you're going to reduce your emissions X%. And if you don't, you have to pay a penalty in terms of step up. So your capital is getting more expensive. That's a very neat way for a company to put their money where their mouth is, as in not just promises, but back it up with financial penalties if you don't follow up on your targets. So this is a really nice way. I'd like my concluding words to be engage in equities, deny debt. I don't know if there's many investors in the room, but it's still a good mantra to follow.
Excellent. I should remind our panellists these are brief closing words.
Okay, I'll be brief. So thank you for the questions. And I think from an EU regulatory perspective, there's three goals. So to reallocate capital towards more sustainable activity, to embed sustainability risk into risk management and capital allocation, but also to foster transparency and disclosure requirements. And from an investment perspective, a twin regulation to the CSRD and the taxonomy regulation is the Sustainable Finance Disclosures Regulation, which effectively categorizes funds as green, darker green, which is a better form of green, as I'm told, and not green, effectively. And that's a way for organisations to look at where their investment portfolio and what is green and what's not green. There is no incentive to do that. It's purely through a disclosure mechanism, but that is one mechanism that is being looked at. In terms of the second point, I'm pretty shocked by that percentage. I can speak from a Deloitte perspective, and I suppose with our name everywhere here, you can imagine we were heavily involved from a philanthropy donation perspective at DCU, which we're really proud of and heavily involved in as well. But also a number of other initiatives from a climate perspective. So Chapter Zero Ireland is one that we're heavily involved in. It's a forum of the World Economic Forum, which educates independent non-executive directors on climate change, because they're the ones at board level that can make the biggest impact for some of these largest corporates. And we're also involved as well with the International Centre for Sustainable Finance, and I believe Bank of Ireland as well are involved with this as well through Sustainable Finance Ireland. So Paul clearly knows a lot about it. So there are just some examples of, because I totally agree, collaboration in the market is key when it comes to tackling issues such as climate change and biodiversity.
Okay. Wonderful. Last, let you all go home soon. But just on, I think like Mark, the philanthropy question, and sorry for the other question on the disclosures, I think it has been well discussed. Again, getting back to the question, companies need a social license to operate, and to a large extent, the contents of that social license has been in the control of the company, what they say, okay? To Mark's point around transparency, there's going to be, again, from the legislation that goes back to the CSRD, even there's another, whatever, about a 3 or 4 letter acronym, you have the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD, so a 5 letter acronym. But what I think is going to happen there is that there'll be a requirement on companies to report the good, the bad, and the ugly. Okay, and that's then, particularly in the social space, I think is going to cause the social to bubble up where the environment is now. And I think you're going to see, again, from the suite of legislation that's coming down the road, issues around social issues that are concepts around social issues that heretofore haven't been on the radar because they weren't disclosed. So I think that's another one of the outcomes from that round thinking or the thinking around the Green Deal that has spawned these various pieces of legislation. So I think from that point of view, and to Paul's point, we will see a major shift in how corporates function over the next 10, 15, 20 years. It's going to take that time.
Fantastic. I think that's a brilliant note to end on. We're going to see a major shift in how corporates function soon, hopefully. So I want to thank everyone in the audience for their questions. Apologies if you didn't get a chance to ask your question. Come and ask them the question in the pub. You'll get a more honest answer. And I finally want to thank our 4 panellists, Paul, Fabiola, Marc and John, for their fantastic insights.